Lady Chatterley's Lover. Continuation story, and it is a little raunchy, with me, Morel Benard, reading Lady Chatterley's Lover. He too had bared the front part of his body, and she felt his naked flesh against her as he came into her. For a moment he was still inside her, turgid, there and quivering. Then, as he began to move in the sudden, helpless orgasm, there awoke in her new strange thrills, rippling inside her, rippling, rippling, like a flapping, overlapping of soft flames, soft as feathers, running to points of brilliance, exquisite, and melting her all molten inside. It was like bells rippling up and up to a culmination. She lay, unconscious of the wild little cries she uttered at the last. But it was over too soon, and she could no longer force her own conclusion with her own activity. She was different. She could do nothing. She could no longer harden and grip for her own satisfaction upon him. She could only wait and moan in spirit as she felt him withdrawing and contracting, coming to the terrible moment when he would slip out of her and be gone. Whilst all her womb was open and soft and softly clamouring like a sea anemone under the tide, clamouring for him to come in again and make a fulfilment for her. She clung to him unconscious of passion, and he never quite slipped from her, and she felt the soft bud of him within her stirring, and strange rhythms flashing up into her with a strange rhythmic growing motion, swelling till it filled all her cleaving consciousness. And then began again the unspeakable motion that was not really motion, but pure, deepening whirlpools of sensation, swirling deeper and deeper through all her tissue and consciousness, till she was one perfect, concentric fluid of feeling. And she lay there, crying in unconscious, inarticulate cries. The voice out of the uttermost night, the life. The man heard it beneath him with a kind of awe, as his life sprang into her. And as it subsided, he subsided too, and lay utterly still, unknowing, while her grip on him slowly relaxed, and she lay inert. And they lay and knew nothing, not even of each other, both lost. Till at last he began to rouse and become aware of his defenceless nakedness, and she was aware that his body was loosening its clasp on her. He was coming apart, but in her breast she felt she could not bear him to leave her uncovered. He must cover her now, forever. But he drew away at last and kissed her and uncovered her over, and began to cover himself. She lay, looking up to the boughs of the tree, unable as yet to move. He stood and fastened up his breeches, looking round. All was dense and silent, save for the awed dog that lay with its paws against his nose. He sat down again on the brushwood and took on his hand in silence. She turned and looked at him. "We came off together that time," he said. She did not answer. "It's good when it's like that. Most folks live their lives through and they never know it," he said, speaking rather dreamily. She looked into his brooding face. "Do they?" she said. "Are you glad?" He looked back into her eyes. "Glad," he said. "Hey, but never mind." He did not want her to talk, and he bent over her and kissed her, and she felt, so he must kiss her forever. At last she sat up. Don't people often come off together? She asks with naive curiosity. A good many of them never. You can see by the raw look of them. You spoke unwittingly, regretting he had begun. Have you come off like that with other women? He looked at her amused. I don't know, he said, I don't know. And she knew he would never tell her anything he didn't want to tell her. She watched his face, and the passion for him moved in her bowels. She resisted it as far as she could, for it was the loss of everything to herself. He put on his waistcoat and his coat, and pushed away through to the path again. The last level rays of the sun touched the wood. I won't come with you, he said. Better not. She looked at him wistfully before she turned. His dog was waiting so anxiously for him to go, and he seemed to have nothing whatever to say. Nothing left. Connie went slowly home, realizing the depth of the other thing in her. Another self was alive in her, burning, molten and soft in her womb and bowels, and with this self she adored him. She adored him till her knees were weak as she walked. In her womb and bowels she was flowing and alive now and vulnerable, and helpless in adoration of him as the most naive woman. It feels like a child, she said to herself. It feels like a child in me. And so it did. As if her womb, that had always been shut, had opened and filled with new life, almost a burden, yet lovely. If I had a child, she thought to herself, if I had him inside me as a child, and her limbs turned molten at the thought, and she realized the immense difference between having a child to oneself and having a child to a man whom one's bowels yearned towards. The former seemed in a sense ordinary, but to have a child to a man whom one adored in one bowels and one womb, it made her feel she was very different from her old self, and as if she was sinking deep, deep to the centre of all womanhood and the sleep of creation. It was not the passion that was new to her, it was the yearning adoration. She knew she had always feared it, for it left her helpless. She feared it still. Least, if she adored him too much, then she would lose herself, become effaced, and she did not want to be effaced, a slave, like a savage woman. She must not become a slave. She feared her adoration, yet she would not at once fight against it. She knew she could fight it. She had a devil's self-will in her breast that could have fought the full, soft, heaving adoration of her womb and crushed it. She could even now do it, or she thought so, and she could then take up her passion with her own will. Ah, yes, to be passionate, like a banshee, like a banshee, fleeing through the woods, to corn and ishas, the bright phallus that had no independent personality behind it, but was pure God's servant to the woman, the man, the individual. Let him not dare intrude. He was but a temple servant, the bearer and keeper of the bright phallus, her own. So in the flux of new awakening, the old, hard passion flamed in her for a time, and the man dwindled to a contemptible object, the mere phallus bearer, to be torn to pieces when his service was performed. She felt the force of the banshee in her limbs and her body, the woman gleaming and rapid, beating down the male. But while she felt this, her heart was heavy. She did not want it. It was known and barren, birthless. The adoration was her treasure. It was so fathomless, so soft, so deep, and so unknown. No. She would give up her hard, bright female power. She was weary of it, stiffened with it. She would sink in the new bath of life, in the depths of her womb and her bowels that sang the voiceless song of adoration. It was early yet to begin to fear the man. I walked over by Marche and I had tea with Mrs. Flint, she said to Clifford. I wanted to see the baby. It's so adorable, with hair like red cobwebs. Such a dear. Mr. Flint had gone to market, so she and I and the baby had tea together. Did you wonder where I was? Well, I wondered, but I guess you had dropped in somewhere to tea, said Clifford jealously. With a sort of second sight, he sensed something new in her, something to him quite incomprehensible. But he ascribed it to the baby. He thought that all that ailed Connie was that she did not have a baby, automatically bring one forth, so to speak. I saw you go across the park to the iron gate, my lady, said Mrs. Bolton, so I thought perhaps you'd call at the rectory. I nearly did, then I turned towards Marhay instead. The eyes of the two women met. Mrs. Bolton's grey and bright and searching, Connie's blue and veiled and strangely beautiful. Mrs. Bolton was almost sure she had a lover. Yet how could it be? And who could it be? Were there a man? Oh, it's so good of you. If you go out and see a bit of company sometimes, said Mrs. Bolton. I was saying to Sir Clifford, it would do her ladyship a world of good if she'd go out among people more. Yes, I'm glad I went. And such a quaint, dear, cheeky baby, Clifford, said Connie. It's got hair just like spider webs, and bright orange, and the oddest, cheekiest pale blue china eyes. Of course it's a girl, or it wouldn't be so bolder than any little Sir Francis Drake. You're right, my lady, a regular little Flint. They were always a forward, sandy-headed family, said Mrs. Bolton. Wouldn't you like to see it, Clifford? I've asked them to tea for you to see it. Who? He asked, looking at Connie in great uneasiness. Mrs. Flint and the baby, next Monday. You can have them to tea up in your room, he said. Why, don't you want to see the baby? She cried. Oh, I'll see it, but I don't want to sit through a tea with them. Oh, cried Connie, looking at him with wide, veiled eyes. She did not really see him. He was somebody else. You can have a nice, cosy tea up in your room, my lady, and Mrs. Flint will be more comfortable than if Sir Clifford was there, said Mrs. Bolton. She was sure Connie had a lover, and something in her soul exalted. But who was he? Who was he? Perhaps Mrs. Flint would provide a clue. Connie would not take her bath this evening. The sense of his flesh touching her, his very stickiness upon her, was dear to her, and in a sense holy. Clifford was very uneasy. He would not let her go after dinner, and she had wanted so much to be alone. She looked at him, but was curiously submissive. Shall we play a game, or shall I read to you, or what shall it be? She asked uneasily. You read to me, said Connie. What shall I read, verse or prose or drama? Read Racine, she said. It had been one of his stunts in the past to read Racine in the real French grand manner, but he was rusty now, and a little self-conscious. He really preferred the loudspeaker. But Connie was sewing a little frock silk of primrose silk, cut out one of her dresses for Mrs. Flint's baby. Between coming home and dinner, she had cut it out, and she sat in the soft, quiescent rapture on herself sewing, while the noise of the reading went on. Inside herself she could feel the humming of passion like the after-humming of deep bells. Clifford said something to her about the Racine. She caught the sense after the words had gone. Yes, she said, looking up at him. It is splendid. Again he was frightened at the deep blue blaze of her eyes and of her soft stillness sitting there. She had never been so utterly soft and still. She fascinated him helplessly, as if some perfume about her intoxicated him. So he went on helplessly with the reading, and the throaty sound of the French was like the wind in the chimneys of her. Of the Racine she heard not one syllable. She was gone in her own soft rapture, like a forest, soughing with a dim, glad mauve of spring moving into bud. She could feel in the same world with her the man, the nameless man, moving on beautiful feet, beautiful in the phallic mystery. And in herself, in all her veins, she felt him, and his child was in all her veins like a twilight. For hands she had none, nor eyes, nor feet, nor golden treasure of hair. She was like a forest, like the dark interlacing of the oak wood humming inaudibly, with myriad unfolding buds. Meanwhile the birds of desire were asleep in the vast interlaced intricacy of her body. But Clifford's voice went on, clapping and gurgling with unusual sounds. How extraordinary it was! How extraordinary he was, bent there over the book, queer and rapacious and civilized, with broad shoulders and no real legs. What a strange creature! With a sharp, cold, inflexible will of some bird, and no warmth at all. One of those creatures of the afterwards that have no soul, but an extra alert will, cold will. She shuddered, a little afraid of him, but then the soft, warm flame of life was stronger than he, and the real things were hidden from him. The reading finished. She was startled. She looked up, and was more startled still to see Clifford watching her with pale, uncanny eyes, like hate. "Thank you so much. You do read Racine beautifully," she said softly. "Almost beautifully as you listen to him," he said cruelly. "What are you making?" he asked. "I'm making a child's dress for Mrs. Flint's baby." He turned away. A child. That was all her obsession. After all, he said in a declamatory voice, one gets all one wants out of Racine. Emotions that are ordered and give shape are more important than disorderly emotions. She watched him with wide, vague, veiled eyes. "Yes, I'm sure they are," she said. "The modern world has only vulgarized emotions by letting it loose. What we need is classic control." "Yes," she said slowly, thinking of him, listening with vacant face to the emotional idiocy of the radio. People pretend to have emotions, and they really feel nothing. I suppose that is being romantic. "Exactly," we said. As a matter of fact, he was tired. This evening had tired him. He would rather have been with his technical books or his pit manager or listening in to the radio. Mrs. Bolton came in with 2 glasses of malted milk for Clifford to make him sleep, and for Connie to fatten her again. It was a regular nightcap she had introduced. Connie was glad to go when she had drunk her glass, and thankful she needed help Clifford to bed. She took his glass and put it on the tray, and took the tray to leave it outside. "Good night, Clifford. Do sleep well. The Racine gets into one like a dream. Good night." You have been listening to Lady Chatterley's Lover. Lady Chatterley's Lover with me, Morel Benard. Please listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's Lover. For now.